Hey the Emperors, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for tuning in. So today I want to hop right into it. We're getting into part 2 of the Heirloom ghost stories. So what this means is I'm going from my grandparents' generation to my parents' generation of ghostly happenings in our family. So if you haven't watched part 1, I suggest doing that. I'll have that link below in the description so you can see this voyage from here to here, and hopefully to part 3 where I'll go over my personal experiences. So just like in the first video, I'm going to begin with my mom's side of the family. So like I talked about in my first video, my grandfather had many experiences growing up in this area. So he and my grandmother married and they bought a house in the early 60s on a kind of a backwoods area just outside of town. And you know, from there he started a fairly successful business and, you know, raised 6 kids. So, you know, it was pretty good. Although the house that he purchased had a history of death, murder, adultery, and so much sorrow. In the 20s, when the house was originally built, the owner of the home was murdered by his wife's lover, confidant, friends with benefits, however you want to put it. He was standing in the living room and the wife's lover snuck up behind him and cut his throat. He died there, right in what would become the living room. And the story would hang over that house's head, and anyone who lived in that house or entered that house, it would hang over their heads for the next 80 years. So in the late 60s, my mom was born and she was the last one of 6. So, you know, she was kind of the baby of the family. They had a little farm, so typical farm life, you know, animals, the butchering of those animals. So the sight of blood or violence wasn't really jarring, just because that was just a fact of life. So my mom, growing up throughout her life, she had several dreams that would come true, whether that was someone being pregnant, someone passing away, you know, coming into money or sudden loss of money, things like that. She would dream of them, and then a few days later they would happen. Now, in her area, she was in the woods, pretty far back in the woods at that time. Now, if you go to that house today, it's actually very close to town and arguably part of town. So, you know, like most kids who grew up in the boondocks, she would go out in the woods and play with friends or just go on her own for a walk. In the forests around her house, she would say that she would often hear things and see things out of the corner of her eye. They weren't malevolent, they were just there, watching. And every day, she said they got a little more bold. Started with a small shadow peeking from behind a tree. And eventually, after several years, her daily walk through the woods turned into a meeting. She told me that there in the woods, she saw a spirit emerge from a tree that took the form of a man. She was about 10 years old at the time. She said that that man told her of her life. Both of my parents have pretty unique birthmarks, and the spirit that emerged from the tree told her that she would marry a man with a very unique birthmark. She was also told of things that would happen later within the family about my grandparents passing away and different things of that nature. At the time, she didn't put much thought into it. However, little by little, those things started to come true. She married a man who had a very unique birthmark and had one child, which was me. My grandfather passed away in a manner similar to what was described to her. My grandmother passed away in a similar manner that was described to her. However, this wasn't the only experience that she had in that area. So in the house, she said at night, it would always feel as if something was in the hallways, just pacing, like a caged tiger, just waiting for its next meal. She said at night it was best to lock the door, lest it be slightly opened, and in the darkness you could see a faint glimmer of an eye staring at you in your bed. When I was a child, I know I didn't like that house, but I can't imagine living there and growing up there. My mom often told me stories of feeling watched in the home, no matter what time of day it was. Even if the sun was bright, she could feel the inner darkness within that home. During her growing up there were a lot of things that happened within our family and within the families that were nearby. You know, life, especially out in Appalachia, has its hardships. She said often that it felt as if someone was watching you at all times. Even if the sun was high in the sky, you could feel the darkness seething from the walls. She said that oftentimes as a child, she would talk to people who no one else could see. She doesn't remember these stories too intricately, but she does remember oftentimes as she got older and would see the newspaper, those people would also be in the obituary section speaking with her. Her growing up experience in that home was, spiritually speaking, so full of various spiritual entities and little chance encounters that it really drew some profound questions about what exactly happened there at that house. And unbeknownst to her, the murder that I discussed previously was just the start. And I hope to get into that in part 3 of this series. Now, my mom wasn't the only one affected by these things. My uncle, her older brother, he also had some weirdness follow him from that house. He was very much into cars, so, a kid of the 70s, really into building cars and all that good stuff. So little by little, he built his dream car, which was a Plymouth Fury from the late 50s. In doing so, he really sunk his soul into building this car from scratch, just from starting out with some few spare parts or old parts here and there to special ordering parts from local mechanics who could obtain them or local dealerships that could obtain them. As he built the car, he just felt this sense of lurking about in his shop. And much like my mother described in the house, there was always that sense of you were being watched, maybe maliciously. Maybe not. It was hard to tell. So my uncle, as he built this car, things started to happen. The ignition would come on at random intervals. The lights would come on without anything being connected. The car would move, but without any external force touching it or touching anything that would make it move. The gear shifter would move on its own. And, initially this could have been chopped up to poor craftsmanship or him not being too good at putting cars together. However, every time he would take it to a professional mechanic, and the mechanic would say that there was nothing wrong with the car and there was no reason for it to be doing that. My uncle would never complete that car. When he was almost done with it, it came on by itself and lurched forward in the middle of his shop. It could have easily taken him down. It missed him by about 3 inches. He won't talk about it to this day, what happened exactly, but that's what I've been able to pull from him. I do know, however, he wouldn't sell the car, which is very unlike him. He's a very frugal person. He instead took the car apart, his dream car that he spent years building, and scattered the parts in the woods around his house so they could never be put back together. Now, all families have their secrets, of course, so I'm giving away as much as I feel comfortable, and I feel as comfortable that my family would be okay with. So we're going to switch to the other side, my father's side. As mentioned before in my first video in the series, my grandfather and grandmother lived also out in the woods in a different rural community. Now, for those of you that don't live in a rural environment, let me tell you, without streetlights or light pollution, the night of a new moon can be scary, especially if you're in the middle of the woods. You are completely enveloped in darkness, nothing but the stars. You better hope it's not cloudy either. And that was the scene many nights at the house that my father grew up in. So as one can imagine, the minds might start to play tricks on you. My father was the last of 12 children. And in this house in the middle of the woods, which is still very much to this day out in the middle of nowhere, much like my mother, he talked about the house always feeling heavy and the constant gaze of someone staring at you. Now, as a child, he, like most children, wound up helping out with stuff around the house or the farm, and oftentimes playing in the woods. Back from the house I would say about half a mile in the woods, there was an abandoned hunting house, so just kind of a shack, more or less. It had been abandoned for years. It was built in the 1800s. In those woods, once you got closer to that house, it seemed as if time stopped. Everything was just feeling a bit off as you got closer. My dad said that the closer you got to the house, the more you felt like you were back in those times. I thought that he was just joking around, or maybe that was kind of an accurate sense of the general atmosphere and environment. As I came to find out personally, that wasn't it at all. And I had the same experience as my father. He would get close to the house, and even though it had been abandoned for a very long time, you could hear speaking voices inside, even though you looked in the busted out windows and nothing was there. So after this, a lot of times he would go back to the house scared. Now, given that he was just a child, it was often laughed off but secretly believed by the rest of the family. So my dad, like many people in this area, one of the big things to do, especially in the 80s, for entertainment was to just kind of go on a drive with your friends because there was pretty much nothing else. So he and his friends went out to this really back road. It's in between all the little villages around, and they came across a church. And they were there in the parking lot. They were drinking and talking and laughing and joking, just, normal teenager stuff. Suddenly they hear a loud, deep voice go,
"You're on church property. You need to leave."
They hear Crowley scream in the distance. So he and his friends, being that they're 17, drunk, and on the back road in the middle of nowhere, say, well, what the fuck are you gonna do about it? The voice repeats, except this time a shadowy figure of a man appears before them, saying,
"You're on church property. You need to leave."
My dad and his friend get ready for a fight. They inch closer to this man. As they get closer, they begin to look at the shadow on the ground and realize that the man standing before them either doesn't have a head or it's tucked inside of his shirt. As they inched closer, one last time the voice roared,
"You're on church property. You need to leave now."
Despite them being drunk, they hopped in the car and got out of there as fast as possible. This was something that was very common for my father, to not getting drunk and driving. That was just a really poor choice that was made, and yeah. No, what it was common was events such as this that plagued him throughout his life, whether it was at night, just the feeling of things staring at you, or his trips to the outhouse where it felt as if there were a million eyes in the woods staring at him. Like I mentioned in my other video about my journey with spirituality, my father grew up kind of as a loose Christian, so didn't go to church, didn't really read the Bible, just kind of generally believed in the general gist. And, as he got older and noticed all of these things and just the ever so faint presence of something, he told me that he one night decided to play with a Ouija board, or a Luigi board, however you pronounce it. He began to ask it questions. Now, of course, my father, not believing that this was real, started to ask it kind of silly questions like who had a crush on who, or what his girlfriend, if his girlfriend was cheating on him, that kind of stuff. And he insulted it. He called it stupid, called it fake. And the planchette started to move rapidly around the Ouija board, spelling out FUCKYOU. My dad and his friends took their hands off the planchette as it started to spin rapidly, landing on the letters KILL. Needless to say, he and his friends were pretty spooked, so they threw it in the closet and walked away. Over the next week, at night, Dad would hear the closet door open and hear the spinning of the planchette. After a week of this, he opened the closet door and decided it was time to go. He decided that it was time to get rid of this thing. So he and his friends dug a pit and set it on fire. It didn't burn. It was soaked with gas. Would not burn. The flames from the heat were very hot enough to singe eyebrows, and it wouldn't burn. It wouldn't even melt. So they opted to bury it and to hope that would be it. But that was very, very far from it. And like I said in my first video, my father had some other experiences in that house where he would see apparitions of people that had recently passed, or even people that were still with us, but not quite where they should be. He always told me that he slept in the top of the house, so the second floor, in a kind of a bunk bed. And he said at the bottom of the stairs there was a door, and if you didn't close that door every night, you would hear the heaviest, most methodical footsteps steadily going up and down the stairs all night. And he oftentimes talked about two eyes peering out of the distance, just looking at you. Even as you tried to slide under the covers, it kept its gaze. Never did anything other than just stand there, at least for a while. As time went on, my parents met, and my mom was staying with him in that house, and Sure enough, she experienced it too. One night, she had stayed there and my father had gotten up to go to the bathroom, which at that point was an outhouse. He did not close the door on his way out. So my mom began to hear those same heavy, methodical footsteps. And then it got different. She felt something sit on the bed and she assumed it was my dad, and she turned to look. Nothing was there. As she looked closer, she could see an indent of something on the bed, yet nothing was there causing that indent. When she jumped back, it moved. The indent was gone. She could hear the floorboards creaking. Understandably, she was pretty scared, so she started getting under the covers, and then my dad happened to come back up the stairs at that point, and she told him what happened, and that's when he began to tell her everything. So the next night comes, obviously pretty shaken up by her experience. She opted to stay home. So my dad is asleep at night, and he's pretty upset. So he decides that he is going to leave the door open and to whatever this thing is that's been watching him his entire life. So he does, and just like every night before, those slow, methodical, heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, that same piercing set of eyes staring at him from the darkness. Except this time, instead of hiding, he asked what it wanted, and it just said one word:
Kill.
Suddenly, he felt as if he couldn't move. It felt as if he was being strapped to the bed, and suddenly he went unconscious. Then he woke up, but he was somewhere else, and there was not one, not two, not even three, but 6 of these beings around him. In a bright room, he said that they were tall, about a little over 6 feet tall, very slim, and all had piercing black eyes. He asked them what the hell they were doing there and what the hell they wanted. And again, just that one word:
Kill.
My father went unconscious again, and the next morning woke up in his bed. At first, he chalked it up to a nightmare, until he looked down at his chest. He was covered in scratches. And for us millennials and Gen Zers, we might not remember, but the way they used to test allergies was to take a brick of spikes with different material and then lightly apply it somewhere on your body to check which allergic reaction. Yeah, so if there was a spot that had an allergic reaction, they could tell you were allergic to whatever it was. My dad's chest and upper body, other than his neck and face, were covered, while the rest of his body had scratches. This would happen to my father 7 more times, each time those same 6 gray figures, only giving him the same answer of kill. And that was it. Eventually, my mom started to live with him. She moved out from her house and began staying and living with him and his family full time. While these same 6 figures never returned, their presence was definitely felt. My aunts and uncles will even talk about feeling dark, piercing eyes watching you. Now, they themselves have all had all kinds of experiences that unfortunately I don't really know that much about. With my father and mother, however, they learned to live with this paranormal stuff, locking the door at the bottom of the stairs, making sure you didn't go outside at this time, or if you did, you did whatever. So eventually, this all culminates with my parents moving out, and like I talked about in my last video, where they're discussing this with my grandfather, who refused to believe any of this, how there was a figurine sitting on top of my grandfather's TV, which was a good 20 feet away from where they were, and around a corner, as they were discussing everything that happened in that house and why they were leaving. This glass figurine found its way from the top of the TV, 20 feet down, around a corner, to land squarely between my grandfather and my parents. They looked at the ornament, my dad put it back on the TV, and they left. Now, we visited my grandfather many times before he passed, but I never stayed there. I was not allowed to stay there, and I hope to be able to tell you more about that in episode 3. The only other experience of note I can think of was after my father had moved out. His sister was still living there, and they were cleaning out that top room of that second floor that my father had stayed in. And she was cleaning with my other aunt, and the radio began to play different songs. It went from like country or pop or whatever they were into to like gospel. So they changed back. And I should note that this house was old and the electricity was put in later. So one of the outlets actually wound up being in that same closet that the Ouija board came from. And they had happened to plug the radio into that particular outlet in that closet. Every time they would change the radio back from gospel to whatever it was that they were listening to, it would turn back to gospel, but even louder. And the voices became more and more distorted and deep. As this continued, they started to get more terrified, so they actually unplugged the radio. Yet, to their surprise, the radio flickered back on and continued to blast this distorted gospel at them. So they opted to put the radio back in the closet and leave the house, and that's actually what spurred her to move out as well. It's important to note that my grandfather lived there until he died. He actually died in that house, just like his parents. And as of today, my uncle lives there, and there's still so much noise in that house. So it does make me wonder if they're still there, waiting, or what's there with them, waiting to meet the rest of us. Alright, well guys, that was Heirloom Ghost Stories Part 2, my parents' generation. I hope to get into episode 3 and really give you guys my full breadth of experiences because it is a lot, and I was there, I experienced them obviously, so we're going to be able to tell a lot more of a smooth story instead of bits and fragments that I've had to put together. So if you guys like this, let me know, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, send me a TikTok, tweet at me, do something. Anyway, bye!